James from NCC here. Welcome back to our channel where we continue with the Network Plus video series. In this video, we'll be looking at Module B, Address Resolution and Assignment. Now in this section, we'll explore how IP addresses are resolved and assigned. Specifically, we'll look at how devices match IP addresses to physical hardware addresses, a process known as address resolution. Now at the core of modern networking, IP addresses identify devices but not actually communicate. Computers still rely on physical MAC addresses. To bridge this gap, address resolution maps an IP address to a physical IP address. Now when two nodes want to communicate, they can't just use an IP address. Every packet must include a physical address. Now to handle this, IPv4 uses the Address Resolution Protocol, or ARP. ARP works by broadcasting a request across the local network. Who has this address? The device with the IP address replies with a MAC address. Both devices then store this information in their ARP cache for future communication. ARP isn't just for resolving addresses. It can also be used for ARP probes and announcements. Now an ARP probe ensures that no other device is already using a new IP address. An ARP announcement, also called Gratuitous ARP, proactively broadcasts a device identity when it joins or changes its MAC address. Now on IPv6 networks, ARP is replaced with the Neighbor Discovery Protocol, or NDP. Now NDP not only resolves addresses but also provide additional information such as the nearest router to the network's MTU size. Now unlike ARP, NDP uses multicast addresses instead of a broadcast, which reduce network congestion. Whether it's ARP in IPv4 or NDP in IPv6, address resolution is critical for ensuring devices can find each other and communicate across networks. Every time you browse the internet, you use the domain name system, or DNS. Now when you type a web address like www.javatucano.com, your computer automatically translates it to an IP address such as 64.99.80.30. Now this process happens almost instantly, so you never have to remember the numbers behind your favorite website. Now DNS works like a hierarchical directory service. It stores domain names and their matching IP addresses. Unlike IP addresses, domain names are easier to remember because they're made up of words, not numbers. A full domain name is called a fully qualified domain name, or FQDN, and it always has at least 3 parts. Now let's break it down. The top level domain, or TLD, is the ending like .com, .edu, or .uk. Now the domain represents the main organization, such as Java Tucano. A subdomain, which is optional, often used for categories or departments like corporate. Finally, the host name specifies a particular system within the organization, such as mail. Now in short, DNS is the phone book of the internet. It translates human-friendly names into computer-friendly IP addresses, making it possible for us to access websites with ease. When you type a web address, it's the DNS server that makes sure your computer finds the right destination. But unlike a single central server, DNS information is spread out across a distributed system of name servers. These servers store domain name assignment inside a database that's broken into zones. Each zone is a portion of the DNS hierarchy managed by a specific administrator. This structure allows the entire internet to stay organized and responsive. Now there are several types of name servers. First, the authoritative name server. It contains the original records configured by the zone manager. Then, the secondary name server. It holds a read-only copy, providing backup and load sharing through a process called zone transfer. And finally, the root name servers, the backbone of the DNS, containing lists of all the top-level domains like .com, .org, and .net. There are only 13 root servers, but with redundancy and Anycast technology, thousands of copies exist worldwide. DNS servers aren't just for the public internet. Many organizations separate them into internal DNS, which only answers requests from the inside the network, and external DNS, which responds to public queries about websites and services. For businesses that don't want to manage DNS themselves, third-party providers or cloud services could take on the job. This makes DNS management easier, but if the external service is down, even internal network functions can be affected. In this section, we're going to look and explore DNS records, which are essential for mapping domain names to IP addresses and other critical services. Now, DNS servers maintain databases of resource records, and as a network technician, you'll need to know the most common ones. Now, let's go through them. We've got an A record. It maps a host name to an IP address. We've got a AA record, maps a host name to an IPv6 address. C name record, which is a canonical name, lists additional name aliases corresponding to the same IP address. MX record, which is a mail exchanger, maps a domain name to a list of mail servers for that domain. NS record, or a name server, identifies authoritative DNS servers for a zone within a domain. PTR record, or a pointer, it points to a canonical name used for reserved DNS lookups to discover the host name of a known IP address. SOA record, or state of authority, provides authoritative information about a DNS zone, such as the primary name server and administrator contact info. SRV record, or service locator, indicates the location or host or port of a particular network service. TXT record, or text, initially used for non-standard human-readable attributes such as company or personal information. Today, TXT is only used for machine-readable fields, including security features. Now, since domain names are constantly updated, DNS records can't last forever. Now, that's why each record has a time to live, or a TTL value. TTL defines how long in seconds a DNS server or host should cache the result of a query before requesting a new copy. Now, a longer TTL reduces server load and limits the immediate impact of failure, but it also delays the spread of changes, like when an IP address is updated. A shorter TTL helps reduce disruptions when changes happen, but increases query traffic. Now, typically, fast-changing records such as IP addresses may have a TTL between 5 minutes and 1 hour. Meanwhile, records that rarely change, like a CNAME or a TXT record, may have a TTL ranging from 1 day up to a week. Now, DNS isn't a secure protocol by default. Now, this makes it a common target for attackers, from reconnaissance to DNS poisoning attacks that disrupt resolution or redirect users to malicious sites. Now, to counter these threats, we use DNS security extensions, also known as DNSSEC. These extensions allow clients to authenticate responses from a secure DNS server, help preventing many network attacks that exploit DNS weaknesses. Now, DNS key contains a public key, allowing resolvers to verify the DNS server. RRSEG, a digital signature used to verify another resource record. Each resource record has a matching RRSEG. DS, or delegation signer, a digital signature from the parent's domain secure DNS server, used to verify that the DNS key is valid. NSEC, or Next Secure, provides a link to the next record in a zone and helps prevent insertion of false records. Now it's important to note that DNSSEC still uses normal DNS lookups. The difference is that it adds these security related records to ensure the data being returned is authentic. In addition, 2 new protocols have been developed to secure DNS lookups using the Transport Layer Security or TLS. Now DNS over TLS or DOT adds encryption to DNS records. It uses TCP or UDP port 853 and is usually implemented at the operating system level. DNS over HTTPS or DOH sends DNS requests via the HTTPS protocol, the same one used for web browsers. It works over TCP port 443 and can be implemented at the operating system level or browser level. Now when you type a domain name like www.nasa.gov into your browser, your computer doesn't know the IP address yet. It needs to resolve the name, and that's where DNS resolution comes in. Now a DNS server holds a database of IP addresses and communicates with other servers in a global system. Now typically DNS queries use UDP port 53, but when a lot of data is involved, TCP port 53 can also be used. Now the DNS resolution process balances 2 things. 1, minimizing DNS traffic, and 2, keeping records updated when the network changes. Now a key feature in DNS caching, each computer and DNS server stores recent answers. Now that way, repeated queries don't require constant DNS lookups. Every system also has a hosts file. It's a local file that maps domain names to IP addresses. Now on Linux or Unix, it's stored at the etc/hosts. On Windows, you'll find it in the c:/Windows/system32/drivers/etc/hosts. Now if the host file or cache has the answer, the query ends there. If not, the request goes to the primary DNS server. Now here's what happens. Now the resolver checks the host file and the cache. If not found, it sends the request to the first DNS server. If the server doesn't know, it forwards the request to the root DNS server. The root server doesn't give the final answer, but refers to an authoritative server like .gov. The authoritative server either returns an IP or refers further down the chain. Once an answer is found, it's cached, sent back to the resolver. The application can now connect using the resolved IP address. Now thanks to this process, your computer can quickly turn easy to remember names into usable IP addresses, keeping the internet running smoothly. Now DNS servers maintain lookup zones containing domains and their associated records. Now there are 2 main types of zones. Forward lookup zone. Now forward lookup zones translate domain names into IP addresses. Now they consist primarily of A or AAA records. Forward zones are used for most DNS activity, like accessing hosts by name. They follow a one-to-one relationship. A name request must return only a single IP address. A reverse lookup zone. Now a reverse lookup zone translates IP addresses back into domain names. They consist primarily of a PTR record. Reverse lookups are more common for logging and troubleshooting than casual internet use. Here, a single IP address can map to multiple names, and one query can return them all. Now the way DNS lookups happens can vary. We've got a recursive lookup. Now with the recursive lookups, the DNS server contacted by the client platform or client performs all additional queries itself before returning the result. This is faster and especially useful for cached values, but it can allow a denial of service attack. Iterative lookup. Now with an iterative lookup, the server doesn't contact others directly. Instead, it returns a referral to the client telling it where to go next. The client continues until it gets the full answer. This reduces load on the servers but requires more work from the client. Reverse lookup. Here the query begins with an IP address and uses a PTR record to find the associated name, host, or domain. For this to work, the name server must have a reverse zone properly configured. Partially qualified domain name. Now, partially qualified domain name is valid only within the domain. It can only be answered by an internal server. For example, mail.corporate might resolve inside an organization's network, but not on the wider internet. A zone transfer. Now, zone transfers replicate entire databases from one DNS server to another. A secondary server can use a AXFR query to get a full copy, or a IXFR query to receive only the changes since the last update. Zone transfers are critical for redundancy and reliability, but must be tightly controlled for security. Forward zones handle domain to IP mapping. Reverse zones handle IP to domain mapping. And different lookup types, recursive, iterative, reverse, partial, and zone transfers define how DNS servers handles requests. Now, in networking, every device needs an IP address. These addresses can be assigned in three main ways. A static address means manually configuring the IP address on the device itself. Dynamic assignment uses a server, usually a DHCP, to automatically provide the IP address. And a link local auto configuration happens when no other method works. In IPv4, it's called APIPA, using the 169.254.0.0/16 range. In IPv6, link local addresses are always present, even if the device also has a global address. Multicast addresses are handled differently. In IPv4, devices use IGMP to join or leave a multicast group. In IPv6, the same role is handled by the MLD, Multicast Listener Discovery. Switches can use IGMP snooping or MLD snooping to manage multicast traffic efficiently. By default, most modern systems use DHCP to retrieve IP address automatically, but sometimes you need to set a static IP address manually. Now, in Windows, you can open the Network and Sharing Center or go to the settings, Network and Internet, and Status. From here, you can configure TCP/IP settings, entering values of or for the IP address, subnet mask, gateway, and DNS server. Static IPs provide consistency, while DHCP keeps things simple and automatic. Understanding both methods is essential for network configuration. A static IP address. Now, the most obvious way is to go to settings. From settings, we're going to go to Network and Internet, and we're going to scroll down to Network and Sharing Center. Another way we can follow is by right-clicking on our network icon in the system tray, open Network and Internet, and also scroll down to Network and Sharing Center. Now, from our Network and Sharing Center, we can click on Change Adapter Settings. Right, this brings up our Ethernet connection. It should be something like Ethernet. You can double-click it. And here we can see from our current display that it says the IPv4 connectivity, no internet access, media status enabled, duration, and also my speed. Right, clicking the details button will bring up the details for the specific connection. From here you can see the physical address, DHCP enabled, auto configuration starting with 169, which is our APIPA IP address, and our DNS server addresses. Now, unfortunately, we cannot make any changes here. Now, to make changes, we need to close this window and click on properties. From the properties, we're going to choose the IPv4 and click properties again. Now, as you can see, this connection is set up for a DHCP because it says the obtain IP address automatically, obtain DNS server address automatically. Now, if I want to do a static, I'm going to have to click on use the following IP address. Now, as you can see there, the DNS server also defaults to me wanting to enter an address. Now, the IP address we're going to use today is 10.10.10.55. I'm going to be pressing the tab key, and as you can see there, the subnet mask is automatically populated. Now, it uses a class A subnet mask because our IP address starts with 10. Now, we won't be using a default subnet mask today. We will be using 255.255.255.0, which is also a /24 subnet. Now, in the default gateway field, we're going to be entering 10.10.10.1, which is typically your router address. From here, we're going to move on to our DNS server. Now, under our DNS server, as a preferred DNS server, we're going to be using 10.10.10.2, which is going to be our primary DNS server, which would typically be our Active Directory functions. All right, we are going to also choose 10.10.10.1, which is the address for our router if our server is offline. Right, from here we're going to click OK to apply the settings, and we're going to click close. And if I go back to the details, I can see that DHCP enabled no, and I have all my static entries entered. From here, I simply just close or open windows. Next up, we're going to configure a static IP address in Kali Linux using terminal commands. Now, to do so, we need to go to the terminal window, keeping in mind that the method for viewing and changing interface settings vary between Linux distributions. Now, in the terminal window, we're going to be typing the following command, ipaddr, and from here we'll be able to view our Ethernet adapter IP address settings. We can also use the command ifconfig, and again there's our Ethernet address settings with also our IPv6. Right, now to change to a static IP address, remember that we can change adapter settings also in a GUI, but that's not always available in Linux. So again, from a terminal window, we're going to be typing the following command. Now, sudo nano etc network and interfaces. Typing our password, and we're going to move down to the last line. Now, from here, we are going to be typing the following commands. The first line, static settings for ETH0. Now, the first line is not actually a command, it is just a comment for human readability. Zero if I face ETH0 inet static address 10.10.15 with a /24, and our last line gateway 10.10.10.1. I'm going to press enter. Right, now to exit and save our settings, I'm going to be pressing Ctrl X. It's going to ask us, do we want to save it? I press Y and I press enter to override the command. Next, we're going to be typing more commands to basically restart our network management service and to make sure that our new settings gets loaded. Now, just to be sure that the other commands disconnect and reconnect the adapter. So the first command, sudo systemctl network.service, and our next command, sudo if down Ethernet 0, and our last one, sudo if up Ethernet 0. Right. Now to view our DNS or our current DNS name servers, now in Linux they're stored separately from our adapter settings. Now they're already correct, so we don't need to change them. So just have a quick look at them. So that's cat etc and right. So there is our name servers. You can see there that's 10.0.0.2 and also 10.10.10.1 and 10.10.10.2. Right, making sure that our static settings is indeed applied. Let's quickly run the IP addr command again and verify that our static internet settings is applied. And as you can see there, 10.10.10.15/24. Now as you can see, our settings are indeed applied. Now manually configuring IP addresses for every device on a network can be frustrating and time consuming. Now that's where DHCP or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol comes in. It automatically assigns IP addresses and other network settings from a central server. And here's how it works. Now the DHCP server assigns addresses using a lease. These leases are temporary but renewable. Leases come from defined list of available addresses called a scope. Now for example, in a subnet of 192.168.10.0/24, the DHCP scope could range from 192.168.10.101 up to 192.168.10.200. Now important to remember, a DHCP scope is just an address range. It's not related to IP address classes. Addresses can be assigned in two ways. Dynamic assignment, which is first come, first serve. Each time a client connects, it gets the next available IP. Reserved assignment, which ties an IP address to a device MAC address. This ensures the same IP is always assigned to that device. Now every lease is temporary. Once it expires, the device must renew it. Short leases work well in networks with high client turnover like public Wi-Fi. Long leases are better for stable networks, reducing disruptions. Now beyond IP addresses, DHCP can also provide additional information called DHCP scope options, such as the default gateway and router addresses, DNS Win server addresses, DNS domain name and suffix, time server info, default TTL value. Now DHCP simplifies network management by automatically assigning and managing IP addresses, reducing errors and ensuring efficient use of address space. Now in DHCP v4, a lease process, it uses a 4-step exchange of broadcast packets between the client and the server. Now this process is often remembered by the acronym DORA: discover, offer, request, and acknowledgement. Now DHCP discover, it begins when the client looks for an active DHCP server by broadcasting a discover packet. The client can also request its last known IP address, such as when it's renewing an existing lease. DHCP offer step, now this, the server then responds with an offer packet. The packet includes an IP address and other configuration details for the client. If reservations are in place, the address offered corresponds to the client's MAC address If not, the server can accept, deny, or ignore requests for specific addresses. DHCP request step. Next, the client responds with a request packet. Now, even though it is called a request, this packet really just accepts the parameters offered by the server. The request is also broadcast, containing the client's MAC address to that. If multiple servers exist, only one will respond. Lastly, DHCP acknowledgement step, and finally, the server sends an acknowledgement packet. It confirms the lease length and other configuration information. At this point, the client is fully configured and ready to communicate on the network. Now, a single DHCP server can provide addresses to multiple subnets. Now, to make this possible, routers are configured with DHCP relay agents with forward DHCP traffic using UDP. And here's how it works. First, when a client sends a broadcast DHCP discover packet, the relay forwards it as a unicast to the DHCP server's IP address. When the server responds, the relay sends the reply back to the client's subnet as a broadcast. Together, the leasing process and relay functions ensure clients across different subnets can receive proper IP configuration from a central DHCP server. Now, DHCP version 6 leasing process is somewhat different from IPv4, mainly because of the changes to IPv6 itself. Now, as an IPv6 protocol, it uses multicast address instead of broadcast. Additionally, an IPv6 client always chooses a link local address using NDP to communicate with the DHCP server. DHCP version 6 scopes, like IPv4, define address range, but IPv6 address spaces are vastly larger. In DHCP version 6, running out of addresses is virtually impossible. Instead, dynamic addresses are usually assigned randomly rather than in sequence. Since modern computers often have multiple network interfaces and multiple MAC addresses, DHCP v6 uses a DHCP unique identifier, or a DUID, for address allocations and client identification. Now, this DUID may be based on a MAC address or manually assigned, but ideally it's stored by the operating system and remains consistent even if the device connects through a different interface. Now, pre-boot execution environment, or PXE, allows a DHCP to do more than just assign network settings. Now, PXE can boot a computer or device automatically over the network using a tiny environment stored in firmware. When the device starts up, it looks for a DHCP server to configure its IP address. The DHCP server must then provide the location of the TFTP server, which contains the configuration file, firmware update, or operating system image. Some examples include an iPhone with firmware already loaded that needs a configuration file for compatibility, a thin client with no local storage that downloads an operating system into memory, or a new PC without an operating system which downloads a stripped down PXE OS and then installs a complete system like Windows or Linux. Now, today, nearly all modern Ethernet adapters support PXE. Now, combined with DHCP and gigabit Ethernet, PXE makes network-based computer setup much easier than relying on DVDs and USB drives. Now, PXE can be extended further into zero-touch provisioning, or ZTP. Now, this method is especially popular for deploying devices like switches, routers, and even mobile devices. When a ZTP-enabled device connects to the network, it uses DHCP and TFTP to retrieve its configuration information automatically. ZTP eliminates manual setup and fully automates provisioning tasks like device configuration, application installation, software licensing, credential management, and mobile device enrollment. ZTP is often used in virtualized data centers, cloud infrastructure, and wireless networks. One important concern, however, is security. This is addressed by the Secure Zero Touch Provisioning, or SZTP, which uses embedded certificates and HTTPS authentication to verify configuration servers. Now in IPv6 networks, DHCP is less necessary because of the stateless address auto-configuration, or SLAAC. Now it uses NDP instead of DHCP server. Now unlike DHCP, a SLAAC router doesn't need to remember scope or assignments. Instead, it tells clients the network prefix. Now from there, clients can self-assign globally routable IPv6 addresses based on their MAC address. Now one drawback of SLAAC is that it doesn't automatically allow DNS server configuration. Though it can be combined with IPv6 DNS servers, some routers also allow DNS assignment via ICMP router advertisement message, though not all systems support this feature. When a host joins the IPv6 network, it follows the following process. The host creates a link local address based on its MAC address, ensuring it's unique on the network. It then uses ICMP to verify uniqueness through a neighbor solicitation and advertisement message. With this link local address, the host sends a router solicitation to identify routers on the segment. SLAAC routers reply with router advertisement message containing a network parameter. Now these may include a routable network prefix, which allows the host to configure a stateless routable address. If no SLAAC router responds, the host will try to acquire a stateful address from a DHCP v6 server. Now this process is similar to DHCP v4 but uses a different message exchange called SARR: solicit, advertised, request, reply. Alternatively, the SLAAC router may simply report the presence of a DHCP v6 server. The host can then use it to acquire DNS and other configuration data. Now traditionally, every NIC has a unique IP address, but in practice, this can be limiting. For example, two redundant servers might share one IP address for failover, or you could assign a virtual IP to a virtual server that runs on a physical host. Now from the outside, all connections are made to one IP, even though multiple systems may be involved. And here's how these problems can be solved. Multi-homing is use multiple NICs for multiple IP addresses. Now alternatively, configure a single NIC with multiple IPs or MAC addresses for greater flexibility. Routers and proxy servers can use network address translation to allow globally routable IPs to reach internal private IP addresses. Now, virtual IP or VIP can be assigned to multiple NICs for load balancing or fault tolerance. Now, protocols like CARP, Proxy ARP, or GLBP make this possible by allowing multiple systems to respond to the same IP. Next, we're going to configure the DHCP server built into the pfSense router. Now, the pfSense router contains a DHCP server. Now, you could configure its settings there. We're going to use the web interface. For that, we're going to use Firefox. We'll be typing in the IP address for our pfSense router. We'll be presented with a logon screen, and we'll just click on sign in. Next, we'll be presented with the pfSense router settings. We're going to click on services and click on DHCP server. Noting here at the top, the server is enabled for the LAN subnet. If you wanted, you could restrict it to only supply leases to known clients. Scrolling down a bit, you'll notice the LAN uses the 10.10.10.0/24 subnet as indicated by the subnet mask. So the router can assign ranges between 10.10.10.1 up to 254. Now it's currently configured to assign dynamic addresses, otherwise known as a scope, between 10.10.10.100 up to 150. But you could change that. these fields, or examining our DNS server. Now these fields in the DNS server are all connecting DHCP clients. Now the default server is the Windows server, which is our primary DNS server 10.10.10.2, and also our secondary would be our router's DNS server 10.10.10.1. Now if we scroll even further, you'll notice that the router is also our default gateway with 10.10.10.1. If the DHCP server were on a separate server, it would specify that router. Now you could change the default lease times, static ARP settings, allowed or denied MAC addresses, or any additional options. Now let's examine our second LAN. Now as you can see, the LAN settings for our second LAN is 10.10.20.0 subnet. Now since DHCP is non-routable, every subnet needs its own server or relay along with its own scope and other settings. Now the settings are very similar to those of the other or the first subnet, but the scope, DNS and gateway has now since changed to indicate 10.10.20.1. On this subnet, DHCP is configured to set a static IP across the Windows secondary NIC. So if we scroll down all the way to the bottom, we can see that a static mapping has been assigned to our server's secondary NIC. Now to configure our own machine with a consistent IP address, even if it is configured via DHCP, so we can do that. But first, let's switch back to our original LAN. Scroll all the way to the bottom, and we can do that from our 10.10.10.0 LAN. Now to do that, we click on the Add button. Now from the Add button, you'll be presented with Copy My Mac. Now clicking the Copy My Mac, it copies my PC's MAC address into the address field. Remember that if you want to add any other computer, you need that computer's MAC address. Now the persistent address that we want is 10.10.10.55. Now you'll notice it's the same IP address as we used in a previous exercise. Now under our DNS servers, we can add our primary and secondary DNS server. So our first one would be our Windows server of 10.10.10.2, and our secondary would be our router 10.10.10.1. Any other settings that we can look at, we've got gateway, DNS, dynamic DNS, NTP, TFTP for PXE boot. Now unfortunately we do need to save these settings. Now saving these settings does not apply the changes. Now as you can see there, we need to still click on apply changes so that your IP address would stay in our static mapping. So let's go ahead and apply our changes. So it says changes successfully applied. Now we can close our window here. Let's go and have a look at our Ethernet card or Ethernet adapters IP address settings. We'll go back to our network and sharing center. Adapter settings. Let's click details again. Now you see there DHCP enabled is still no. Now let's go and change that, and let's apply DHCP settings. So we're going to change that to automatically receive, the same with the DNS server. We're going to click apply or click OK, OK again, and let's click our details again. Now as we can see there, DHCP is now enabled. Yes, our IPv4 address 10.10.10.55 as was specified in our persistent settings in our router settings. Now that's it for IP addressing. Next, we'll look at TCP/IP protocols. Remember to like this video if you found it helpful. Leave a comment, subscribe so you don't miss anything. See you in the next video.